company sold for $75 million. And Laura, I want a divorce.
Before you celebrate, did he tell you who owns the buildings?
Who?
I do.
My husband celebrated selling his company for $75 million by handing me a divorce in front of his family. Then the buyer asked who owned the 2 buildings included in the deal. I looked straight at my husband and said, "I do. Hello. Everyone, my name is Laura Pierce. I was 52 when this happened, and until that night, I believed I understood the life I had spent 19 years building. I lived outside Columbus, Ohio, with my husband, Thomas Whitmore. I had helped raise his son, worked quietly behind the scenes of his business, and supported every decision that was supposed to secure our future. I thought I was his partner. Thomas thought I was temporary. He had planned my exit so carefully that he had already rented an apartment for me and changed the locks on our house. But he had overlooked one detail. 11 months earlier, he had placed the most important part of his company's real estate in an LLC that belonged to me. Before I tell you how that one forgotten signature changed everything, please tell me where you are listening from, which city or country has this story reached. Leave a comment below, because I truly want to know how far my story travels. The night began in a private dining room at an expensive steakhouse in downtown Columbus. Thomas's mother, Margaret, sat across from me wearing the pearls she saved for weddings, funerals, and important family occasions. Thomas's 33-year-old son Jason had ordered champagne before I arrived. That was unusual. Jason normally waited for someone else to choose the wine, especially when his father was paying. At the far end sat Robert Hale and attorney Cynthia Marsh from Northbridge Capital, which had been negotiating to buy Whitmore Industrial Components. The strangest thing was Thomas. After months of surviving on coffee, antacids, and little sleep, he suddenly looked peaceful. He leaned back like a man who had escaped a burning building and no longer cared who remained inside. I asked, "Are we celebrating something?" Thomas smiled. "In a minute." He loved announcements. He believed ordinary information became more valuable if everyone had to wait for it. When the server finished pouring champagne, Thomas stood and lifted his glass. "We finally did it," he said. "We sold the company for $75 million. Jason congratulated him. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest. Robert raised his glass. I stared at Thomas, wondering how a deal still under negotiation that morning was suddenly finished. Then relief washed over me. Whitmore Industrial had consumed much of our marriage. We went to bed discussing contracts and woke up discussing insurance. I had spent countless Saturdays solving problems at the plant. $75 million did not sound like money to me. It sounded like an ending. I believed it might finally be a good one. I raised my glass. "Congratulations." Thomas remained standing. "There's more," he said. Something in his voice made me put my glass down. He looked at Jason. "The structure of the deal secures Jason's future. He'll control the family's remaining interests, and Northbridge has offered him a management role." Jason nodded without looking at me. I asked, "And where does that leave us?" Thomas let out a slow breath. He did not look sad. He looked like a manager preparing to explain an inconvenient policy to an employee. "Laura, we both know the marriage hasn't been right for a long time. The sale changes everything, and I think it's best to make a clean break." I stared at him. "What are you saying?" He spoke calmly enough to make the words feel even crueler. "Jason gets everything that matters. You get a divorce." The room went silent. I laughed once because my mind rejected what my ears had heard. "That isn't funny." I'm not joking. I turned to Jason. He lowered his eyes. That was the moment the room truly changed. Thomas's betrayal hurt, but Jason's silence cut deeper. I had known him since he was 14. I had taken him to appointments, attended his games, and supported him when his own marriage collapsed. I asked, "How long have you known?" He rubbed his thumb along the side of his glass. "A few weeks." "And you said nothing?" Thomas interrupted. "This isn't about Jason." "No," I said. "Apparently it's about everyone except me." Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was quiet and controlled. "There's no reason to make a scene. You should have known your place. Some sentences hurt because they are cruel. Others hurt because they explain your entire life in 6 words. Thomas sat down and folded his hands. "I arranged a furnished apartment for you for 90 days. It's already paid for. That will give you time to decide what you want to do next. You rented me an apartment. I'm trying to make this easier." He had planned my displacement and found a way to call it kindness. I looked around the table. Margaret appeared satisfied. Jason looked ashamed but remained silent. Thomas waited for me to behave reasonably so the evening could return to his schedule. Then I looked at Robert Hale and something practical clicked in my mind. "Robert," I said, "did Thomas show you what I signed last year?" Thomas's expression changed for only a second, but I saw it. Robert frowned. "What did you sign?" Thomas cut in. "Laura, don't start." I ignored him. "Does your purchase include the manufacturing plant on Westerville Road?" Robert glanced at Cynthia. "Yes." "And the distribution warehouse next door?" "Yes." I nodded. Then I think somebody forgot something. Cynthia opened her folder. "Mrs. Whitmore, who currently owns those properties." Thomas leaned back as if the answer were obvious. I said, "LLC does." Thomas gave a dismissive laugh. "Laura, don't embarrass yourself." Robert did not laugh. He turned to Cynthia and said one word, "Stop." She opened her laptop and searched the county records. Within a minute, she found the filing. "LWP Holdings, LLC," she said. "Laura W. Pierce Whitmore is listed as the sole member." Thomas waved one hand. "Yes, technically. The properties were moved for liability reasons. Laura knows that." I looked at him. "I do know that." He pointed at me as though I had proved his argument. "Exactly. Robert asked me, have you signed a deed transferring either property to Whitmore Industrial or Northbridge?" "No." "Have you signed written consent approving their sale?" "No." Thomas said, "She will." I turned toward him. He had just ended our marriage in public. He had already selected the apartment where I was supposed to disappear. His mother had reminded me that I had never truly belonged. Yet Thomas still believed my signature belonged to him. "No," I said. He blinked. "What?" I said no. Margaret made a sound of disgust. Jason leaned toward me, but I raised my hand before he could speak. Thomas lowered his voice. "You're emotional. You don't make financial decisions when you're emotional." I almost smiled. "I've been making financial decisions for you for 19 years. Robert closed the folder in front of him. "No one signs anything else tonight. We verify title before this transaction moves forward." For the first time that evening, Thomas was no longer controlling the room. 11 months earlier, he had been the one who created the problem. Whitmore Industrial had been facing a product liability claim. It was not large enough to destroy the company, but it frightened Thomas. His business attorney advised him to separate the company's real estate from its daily operations. One Thursday evening, Thomas came home carrying a thick folder while I was making chicken soup. He placed the papers beside my cutting board and said, "I need your signature." I wiped my hands and asked what it was. "Real estate restructuring," he answered. That was Thomas's idea of an explanation. I read the documents carefully. A new company called EWP Holdings would own the manufacturing facility and warehouse. My initials were in the name, and I was listed as the sole member. I tapped the page. "This says I control the LLC." "You do? And the LLC owns the buildings?" "Yes." "Why put it in my name?" He was already answering emails on his phone. "Your name is cleaner. I have personal guarantees tied to business credit. This protects the properties, so legally they're controlled through me." He finally looked up. "Laura, they belong to us." "Your name is just cleaner." I was irritated, not suspicious. I had been married to him too long to hear danger in that sentence. So I signed. Afterward, insurance renewals, tax notices, and the lease came to me. When the warehouse roof needed repairs, the contractor needed my authorization. Thomas treated my ownership as a technical detail. I treated it as a responsibility. Now that detail was sitting at the center of his $75 million sale at the restaurant. Robert explained that Northbridge might still buy the operating company, lease the buildings, reduce the price, or delay the closing. I did not possess a giant red button that could destroy the deal. I mattered, but I was not all powerful. Strangely, that made me calmer. I did not want to become reckless. I wanted, for the first time in years, to make an informed choice. Thomas heard only that the sale might survive. "Fine," he said. "We'll fix it Monday." Robert's answer was firm. "My team will review it Monday, and no one will assume Mrs. Whitmore is signing anything until we speak with her separately." Thomas looked at me then. He really looked at me. For the first time in years, I do not think he saw his wife. He saw a person whose consent had value. The dinner ended without dessert. Thomas followed me into the parking lot. He called my name twice before I stopped. "Don't do this," he said. "Don't do what?" "Destroy 20 years because you're hurt." I stared at him. "You rented me an apartment before telling me our marriage was over." I was trying to make the transition easier. "You keep deciding what should be easy for me." He rubbed his forehead. "We can still handle this like adults. You announced my divorce between champagne and steak." His mouth tightened. "That wasn't ideal." "No, Thomas. The salmon was not ideal. What you did was calculated." For half a second, I saw something like shame in his face. Then it disappeared. I drove home because some foolish part of me still believed home was where I was going. I reached the house shortly after 10. The porch light was on. I placed my key in the front door, but it would not turn. I tried again, then walked to the side entrance. That lock had also been changed. Through the garage window, I saw 2 suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes. One box had the word COS written across it in black marker. That was when I understood the full cruelty of Thomas's plan. He had not changed the locks. Because I refused to sign, he had changed them before dinner, before I knew about the sale, and before I knew about the divorce. He had not prepared for my resistance. He had prepared for my obedience. I called my closest friend, Dennis Carter. When she answered, I said, "I think my husband just sold his company, ended my marriage, and locked me out of my house in the same evening." There was a long pause. "Where are you?" she asked. "Home." "No, sweetheart. Apparently you're not. Come here." Then I added, "I may own the buildings he promised to the buyer." Denise became quiet again. But this silence was different. "Definitely come here," she said. When I arrived at the house Denise had bought after her second divorce, she was waiting in pyjama pants and a Cleveland Browns sweatshirt. "Coffee or bourbon?" she asked. "Coffee? That bad?" I need to think. By midnight I had told her everything. Denise listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Let me understand this. He told you to leave and then discovered that he needs your signature?" Basically. She took a slow drink of coffee. "I don't want to interfere in your marriage." I looked at her. She had been interfering in my marriage since 2008. She smiled. "But that is objectively funny." I laughed for 5 seconds. Then I started crying. What hurt most was Jason. I had spent nearly 20 years believing that showing up for him had made me family. His silence showed me how quickly affection could lose to an inheritance. The next morning, Jason arrived at Denise's house. Denise opened the door, looked him over, and called toward the kitchen, "Laura, your inheritance is here." "Denise," I warned. "Sorry, I forgot his name." Jason heard every word. He deserved to. He sat across from me and asked how I was. "Don't," I said. He nodded. "Dad is panicking. Northbridge may delay the closing." Then he should speak to Northbridge. Jason rubbed his palms together. "Laura, I'm asking you not to make this worse." There it was. Not an apology, not concern, just a request for me to stop causing inconvenience. "What exactly do you want?" I asked. "Sign the transfer. The sale protects the company. The employees keep their jobs. Dad can finally retire. And you receive control." His face tightened. "This is not only about me, but it includes you." He looked away. I asked, "Why didn't you warn me about the divorce? What was I supposed to do?" "You're 30, 3 years old, Jason. You were supposed to decide what kind of man you wanted to be." That silenced him. Before he left, he said, "The children keep asking when you're coming over." The words went straight through me. He knew how much I loved his children. I looked down at the table. "Do not use those children to get my signature." His face turned red. He denied doing it, but even he seemed unsure. With people you love, sometimes you cannot tell where weakness ends and selfishness begins. On Monday morning, I met with Rachel Stein, a divorce attorney with sensible shoes and no interest in comforting lives. I brought every document I had concerning LWP Holdings. Rachel read for nearly an hour before speaking. "You are the sole member, and the LLC owns both parcels," she said. I felt hope rise in my chest. Then she added, "But do not start spending the rent in your imagination." Rachel explained that Thomas could not transfer the properties without my consent. Because the buildings had been acquired during our marriage, a court might still consider much of their value marital property. "So I don't own them?" I asked. "That is not what I said. You control the LLC. What portion of the economic value belongs to you after the divorce is a different question." I had carried the LLC in my mind like a weapon. Rachel warned me that using it carelessly could hurt me. Then she slid another document across the desk. "Thomas filed for divorce this morning. His attorneys wanted a temporary order preventing me from selling, refinancing, or transferring the properties while the case was pending. The filing described me as an emotionally distressed spouse whose actions could jeopardize a major commercial transaction." I read the phrase twice. Emotionally distressed. Rachel shrugged. "Distress seems reasonable, but do not move money, threaten Thomas, involve the employees, or demand payment from Northbridge." I wasn't planning to. good. If you behave like the unstable woman they describe, you build their argument for them. The advice irritated me because it was correct. Later that afternoon, Northbridge released correspondence concerning the real estate. Rachel found an email Thomas had written during negotiations. One sentence said, "Laura's signature should be a housekeeping matter." Housekeeping. 19 years of reviewing contracts, organising insurance, solving tax problems, and answering late night calls had become housekeeping. My legal consent was housekeeping. My name on the company that held 2 valuable properties was housekeeping. Rachel turned away from the screen. "If we protect your right to negotiate, what do you actually want?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Did I want the buildings? More money? The sale cancelled. Did I want Thomas to sit in that restaurant and feel 1/10 as small as he had made me feel? I did not know. For the first time since the dinner, not knowing frightened me more than Thomas did. The next afternoon, Margaret arrived at Denise's house without calling. She wore a camel coloured coat and carried her handbag under one arm as if she expected valet parking. She did not remove her coat when she came inside. "This has gone far enough," she said. "Good afternoon to you too." Northbridge postponed the closing. "Thomas has not slept. Jason says no one knows what will happen. Thomas's lawyers, he can ask them." Margaret sat on the edge of the sofa. "Harold began that company with 3 employees. He borrowed equipment and worked 6 days a week." "I know the story." "Then you know this is bigger than your marriage. 200 people depend on that plant. If the sale fails because you are angry, they will not care who was right at dinner." Her words disturbed me because there was truth inside the manipulation. I asked, "Did your husband ever ask what you wanted?" For the first time, Margaret looked uncertain. "My husband built that company. I understood my responsibility." "What was it?" "To support him." "Even when you disagreed?" "Marriage is not a committee meeting, Laura." I almost smiled. "Apparently, it's a sole proprietorship." She ignored the remark. I knew my place. Suddenly, her insult at the restaurant sounded different. It was not kinder. It was simply older. Margaret was defending a rule she had lived under her whole adult life. "So because no one asked you what you wanted?" I said. "No one should ask me." Her eyes hardened. "Marriages survive when people understand their place." I nodded. "Maybe that is why mine didn't." She left 5 minutes later. I could not dismiss everything she had said. The next morning, I drove to the plant to authorise a sprinkler inspection. Whitmore Industrial employed just over 200 people. I knew many of them. Frank Morales from maintenance was 18 months from retirement. Beth in purchasing had a daughter starting nursing school. Calvin in shipping had a wife receiving cancer treatments. These people were not pieces on a board in my divorce. I sat in my car afterward and called Rachel. "I don't want to destroy the sale," I told her. "That does not mean you must sign away your rights." "I know. I just needed to say it aloud." That decision changed the shape of my revenge. I would not punish 200 families to hurt one man. I would protect the employees, protect myself, and make Thomas face every fact he had tried to hide behind the word housekeeping. That afternoon, Robert Hale requested a meeting. He brought Cynthia and I brought Rachel. Thomas was not invited. Robert explained that Northbridge still wanted the operating company. Instead of buying the buildings immediately, it could sign a long-term lease with LWP Holdings at a fair market rate and receive an option to buy later under agreed terms. What happens to the $75 million? I asked. The valuation changes, Robert said. We would be receiving fewer assets, so the sellers would receive less money at closing. There it was, not fantasy revenge, not a miraculous document that made me owner of the entire company, just consequences. Thomas had promised property that he did not control. Now he would receive less because he had treated me as invisible. That evening, he called. I hear you met with Hale, he said. Do you think you're a real estate investor now? No. Those buildings were paid for by the company. I know. My agreement confused him. He had expected me to defend the properties like a child protecting a toy. Then sign the transfer, he said. I leaned against Denise's kitchen counter. You keep saying we built everything together. We did. Then why did that stop being true the moment you sold it? He was silent. Finally, he asked, What do you want, Laura? For 19 years, Thomas had decided what we needed, what made sense, what was best, and what could wait. Now he wanted my answer only because he had run out of his own. I want you to stop answering that question for me, I said, and ended the call. The next morning, Rachel placed 2 legal pads on her desk. If your only purpose is to hurt Thomas, we can make this expensive and ugly, she said. If you want a fair settlement, full disclosure, control of your rights, and protection for the employees, that is a different negotiation. A week earlier, I might have chosen humiliation. But humiliation had been Thomas's weapon. I did not want to rebuild myself by becoming like him. The second negotiation, I said. Rachel nodded. Then she opened another file. There is something else. Of course there was. Northbridge had reopened its financial schedules because the deal had to be restructured around my buildings. At the same time, Rachel had demanded disclosure of everything Thomas and Jason would receive from the sale. The advertised $75 million was real, but it was not the whole story. Thomas also had a consulting agreement that would pay him after closing. He was rolling part of his ownership into the new company. There were performance incentives, deferred payments, and a management package for Jason. None of it appeared illegal, but Thomas had described the transaction as if one simple amount were being divided while other benefits were hidden in separate categories. He was deciding what I would receive, I said, while also deciding what counted. Exactly, Rachel replied. Anything he receives because of this transaction matters in the divorce. He cannot call the convenient part sale proceeds and hide the rest behind different labels. Thomas rarely told direct lies. He preferred categories. If he could rename something, he could convince himself he had been honest. No secret envelope appeared. No stranger sent us a confession. People simply started reading the documents more carefully. Thomas had spent years telling me that details mattered. At last, they mattered to him. 2 days later, Jason asked to meet at a coffee shop in Worthington. He looked exhausted when he arrived. Dad didn't tell me everything, he said. His management agreement included voting restrictions, performance conditions, and trust provisions that would allow Thomas to keep influence over major decisions. Thomas had not given Jason a kingdom. He had given him a kingdom with Thomas's hand still on the thermostat. He said I was taking over, Jason told me. Maybe he believes you are. Jason looked at me. You know what he believes? Yes. If he pays for something, he believes he controls how it is used. The words hung between us. Jason heard the connection. After a long silence, he said, I owe you an apology? Yes. I knew Dad planned to divorce you. I stayed quiet. because I thought the sale would secure my children's future. Mine too. I was afraid that if I challenged him, he would change the deal. There it was. Not noble, not monstrous, just ugly and human. I knew he was betraying you. Jason continued, and I stayed silent because I thought I would benefit. It was the first apology he gave me without an excuse disguised inside it. "Thank you for saying it honestly," I said. "Can you forgive me?" "I don't know." He nodded. "Okay." I respected him for not asking again. The final business negotiation took place the following Thursday at Northbridge's attorney's office. Thomas sat across from me for the first time since the restaurant. He looked older. I probably did too. Robert and Cynthia sat at one end of the table. Rachel sat beside me. Thomas had two attorneys. Jason attended the first part because his compensation agreement had become part of the disclosures. Rachel had warned me that the meeting would not look like television. No one would pound the table. No one would suddenly confess. We would discuss leases, valuations, options, employee protections, and settlement language until we all developed a sincere hatred of paper. She was right. By early afternoon, we had a proposed structure. Northbridge would buy Whitmore Industrial's operating business. LWP Holdings would retain the manufacturing plant and warehouse. Northbridge would lease both buildings at a market rate with an option to purchase later. The employee protections in the original deal would remain. Every payment, benefit, incentive, and ownership interest connected to Thomas and Jason would be fully disclosed. Most importantly, neither Thomas nor any member of his family would control LWP Holdings. Thomas hated it. "This is ridiculous," he said. "She is holding the company hostage." Robert looked up from his notes. "No, Tom." Thomas turned toward him. Robert spoke calmly. "You promised us property you did not control." The room became perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not need to. Thomas stared at me. "You knew what those buildings were for when we put them in your name." "Yes." "They were separated from the company because you wanted them separated." "They were company assets." "Then you should not have treated my ownership like housekeeping." His attorney touched his arm. Thomas pulled away. "After everything I gave you," he said. I had heard versions of that sentence throughout our marriage. The house, the vacations, the car, and the comfortable life were always evidence of his generosity. He never counted the contracts I reviewed, the crisis I solved, the career I set aside, or the years I spent caring for his son. I used to answer by listing my contributions. This time I did not. I simply said, "That is the problem, Thomas. You still believe my life was something you gave me." His expression changed. He did not suddenly understand 19 years of marriage. Life is rarely that cooperative. But he stopped talking. The negotiation continued, and that mattered more. By late afternoon, we had a framework. Thomas would still leave the sale a very wealthy man, but less wealthy than he expected. Jason might still have a future with Northbridge, but it would not be the unrestricted inheritance he had imagined. The employees would keep their protections. I would retain control of the real estate, while the divorce determined the final division of marital value. I was not taking $75 million away from anyone. I was refusing to disappear so everyone else could collect it conveniently. When the revised agreement was placed in front of Thomas, he read it for a long time. Then he signed. I watched his pen move across the page and waited for satisfaction. Instead, I felt sadness. For weeks, I had imagined a moment when Thomas would finally understand what he had done. I expected some look in his eyes that would prove he saw me clearly at last. Sitting there, I realised I might wait the rest of my life for that look. I did not want to wait anymore. Thomas did not have to understand why I was leaving for me to leave. He did not have to agree that I mattered for me to know that I did. Several weeks later, Northbridge completed the acquisition under the revised structure. That afternoon, Margaret sent me a message with 4 words. I hope you're satisfied. A month earlier, I would have written 3 paragraphs explaining the buildings, the hidden benefits, the workers, the divorce, and the changed locks. I would have tried to make her understand. Instead, I deleted the message and returned my phone to my purse. 6 months later, Thomas was still rich. I mention that because people like simple revenge stories. They want the cruel husband to lose the company, the house, the money, and preferably his hair. They want him eating canned soup alone, while the woman he underestimated drives into the sunset. That is not what happened. Thomas left the Northbridge deal with more money than most families will see in several lifetimes. His consulting agreement survived, although every payment was disclosed. He kept an investment in the new company and bought a beautiful condo overlooking the Scioto River. My justice did not come from making him poor. It came from making him negotiate with the woman he had planned to erase. The divorce required appraisals, financial disclosures, and mediation. One afternoon, expensive attorneys spent 40 minutes arguing about a boat Thomas had not used since 2019. I let him keep it. I wanted a future, not a boat full of mildew. In the final settlement, LWP Holdings remained under my control. Northbridge continued leasing the factory and warehouse, giving me substantial long-term financial security. Other marital assets were divided fairly, and all of Thomas's sale-related compensation was included in the negotiations. I did not receive everything. Neither did he. More importantly, for the first time in years, I knew exactly what was mine, what was Thomas's, and where the boundary stood between us. You would be amazed by how peaceful a clear boundary can be. I hired a professional property manager. Denise had imagined me arriving at the plant in dark sunglasses and taking charge, but I knew ownership did not make me an expert. Instead, I returned to contract consulting. A former colleague introduced me to a regional logistics company that needed help renegotiating supplier agreements. Then a second client called, followed by a third. During my first meeting, an executive asked, "Laura, what do you think?" I gave my answer and waited. He wrote it down. That was all. No one interrupted me. No one repeated my idea in different words and claimed it. No one said, "What Laura means is..." I drove home feeling strangely unsettled. It took me a while to understand why. I had forgotten what ordinary respect felt like. Jason and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. I still loved his children, but I stopped pretending everything was fine merely to make family gatherings comfortable. Several months after the divorce, he visited my new townhouse. There was no business deal to save and no signature he needed. He stood in my kitchen with his hands in his pockets and apologized again. "I was a coward," he said. "You were selfish." He nodded. "That too." He asked whether I would ever forgive him. "Probably," I said. "But forgiveness and trust are different things." His face fell slightly. "I understand." "I hope you do." Nothing was magically repaired when he left. I had spent too much of my life believing a family was healthy only when everyone could sit together and pretend no one had been hurt. Jason and I were building something slower and more honest. Margaret never apologized. She continued telling relatives that I had destroyed the family over money. That bothered me until I remembered that Margaret believed a good wife endured whatever her husband decided. If she admitted I was right to say no, she might have to ask why she had spent so many years saying yes. I could not answer that question for her. I no longer needed her to answer mine. A few months later, I attended a retirement dinner for Frank Morales. A new Northbridge executive introduced me to his wife by saying, "This is Laura Whitmore. She used to be Tom's wife." I smiled and offered my hand. "Laura Pierce, actually. I went back to my maiden name." The woman smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Laura." And that was all. The conversation moved on. I realised reclaiming my name felt best when I did not need anyone to be impressed by it. The next morning, I met the facilities manager at the manufacturing property. I arrived early. The old Whitmore Industrial Components sign still stretched across the front of the building. For years, that name had made me proud. Later, it had made me feel invisible. That morning, it was simply the name of my tenant. Near the property office was a small metal plaque that read LWP Holdings LLC. It was not impressive. Most people could walk past without noticing it. I took my keys from my purse. For 1 second, I remembered standing outside my old house, turning a useless key in a lock Thomas had changed before telling me our marriage was over. He had chosen where he thought I belonged. He had packed my clothes, rented my apartment, planned my exit, and still expected me to sign wherever he pointed. I placed my key in the office door. It turned. I smiled, not because I had defeated Thomas. By then, defeating him no longer seemed like the most important thing. I smiled because the door in front of me opened with my key, by my choice, into a life that no one else controlled. Before I finish, here is the heart of my story. My husband tried to use a $75 million business sale to secure his son's future while removing me from the family as quietly as possible. He believed my years of work, my legal ownership, and even my consent were minor details. But the buildings included in his deal belonged to an LLC in my name. Instead of destroying the company in anger, I investigated the documents, demanded full disclosure, protected the employees, and negotiated a fair settlement. Thomas remained wealthy, but he lost the power to define my value or decide my future. What can we learn from this story? Never allow loyalty to erase your identity. Read every document. Understand what is in your name. Keep records of the work you contribute, even when that work is done for people you love. Most importantly, remember that forgiveness does not require surrender, and justice does not always mean destroying another person. Sometimes justice is a clear boundary and honest agreement, and the freedom to choose your own next step. Thank you for watching and listening to my story. If it touched you, please like this video and leave a comment. Tell me where you are listening from, and tell me what you would have done if you were sitting in my chair that night. Thomas once changed the locks to show me where I no longer belonged. In the end, I did not need his key, his permission, or his name, because the life I opened was finally my own.